Okay. So a few years ago, a joint New Zealand-Italian team did a genome sequencing project that was one of the fastest projects to date. And they took about 2 years to document the genetic differences between apples and pears. And what they found was that even though these two fruit are from the same family, they're actually quite different. So they have the same number of chromosomes, as you can see, 17, but apples have 6,000 more genes and 150 million more base pairs than pears. But of course, you don't need the genetics to know that they're different, right? I mean, we all know what an apple tastes like, nice and crisp and sometimes a little bit sour. And some of us would agree with a Greek poet Homer, who said the pears are the gift from the gods because of this beautiful, soft flavor that they have and the melt-in-your-mouth texture. So we know the difference between apples and pears. We also know that if you want to make an American apple pie or you want to make an apple cider, you can't use pears, it has to be apples. And no self-respecting connoisseur of Poire Williams would ever accept apples as a substitute. But there is one situation where you can mix them together. In fact, you can use one or the other, or you can just lump the whole lot together, and that's when you're making a fruit salad. So the question is, why am I talking to you about fruit salads in a sports medicine lecture? And it's because, to my mind, when it comes to recognizing the differences between male and female athletes, sports medicine is more of a fruit salad than a science. Let's go back to the science. This man actually wasn't a scientist. He was the third president of the United States of America, and he actually made a declaration about 200 years ago, which I think he wouldn't get away with today. He said, all men are created equal. And this has been proven by scientists to be actually very true. So this guy is a scientist. His name is David Page, and he's a professor of biology at MIT. His specialty is the human genome, and specifically the Y chromosome. Imagine spending your entire life looking at something, well, I can't even show how small it is. You can't see it without a microscope. But what he said is that 99.9% of all the genetic material in men are shared. So every man on the planet differs by every other man on the planet by 0.1%. So that's very close. What he also said is that men and women are very different. So yes, we have the same number of chromosomes, 23 pairs, but men have an X and a Y, we all know that, and women have two X's. And this is where the difference comes in. So the human genome has more or less 20,000 genes. But on the X chromosome, you carry more than 1,000 genes. And on the Y chromosome, there's less than 50. So this means that men and women carry genes in different amounts. And in fact, men carry some genes that women don't have, and women carry other genes that are twice as much as what men have. Not only that, there are 800 genes that are subject to downstream effects from hormones. So the hormonal milieu in the cell will switch a gene on or switch it off. So if you then do the maths the way that the geneticists do, you find that women and men are different by between 1% and 4%. So that's huge. How do we see this into perspective? Well, in the words of Professor Page, the human male is genetically about as close to a chimpanzee male as he is to a human female. Think about that. And here's the interesting thing. This is not just limited to sex organs. For years, we thought that the differences between men and women were in the sex organs, but this is not true. Every single cell in your body has that set of chromosomes. And this means that every cell in your body has a sex. And there are more than 50 genes that are expressed differently, totally independently of the hormonal milieu in the cell. So what does this mean? It means that men and women are physiologically different. So here's a few examples. Female lung cells, for example, carry more of this CYP1A1 enzyme. And this enzyme is responsible for the metabolism of cigarette smoke. And it's been associated with early onset lung cancer in people who smoke. And indeed, you find that women who smoke develop lung cancer at an earlier age than men who smoke, independent of any hormones. Same thing with male neurons. They show less than 50% the uptake rate of dopamine. And this might be the reason why men are far more likely to suffer from Parkinsonism than women. And this one is a big one. So we all have this enzyme in our livers, CYP3A. This enzyme is responsible for the metabolism of drugs. Up to 50% of all the drugs we know on the market today is metabolized by this enzyme. But women and men have different concentrations of this enzyme in their liver cells, which means that we metabolize drugs differently. This means that the efficacy and the side effects of any particular drug might be different in men and women. And this has been ignored for a very long time. Recently, in the United States, there was a drug called zolpidem. I think we all know it. It's a sleeping tablet. And studies have shown that women have twice the level of zolpidem in their bloodstream when they've taken it. And then the next morning, after they've taken the sleeping tablet, they were involved in far more car crashes because of this drowsiness. So in the end, the FDA in 2013 finally said that the dosage on the box needs to be reduced to 50% for women. But that's just one drug. And as I've said before, 50% of drugs are metabolized by this mechanism. So when is the last time you've picked up a packet of tablets and seen different dosages for men and women on the instructions? I've never seen it. So now the question is, if men and women are that different when it comes to genetics and physiology, does it not make sense that they might be different when it comes to injuries? And the answer is probably. And the reason I'm saying that is if you look at the injury and illness surveillance that come from big sporting competitions in the last few years or last couple of decades, it seems the interesting thing is that what gets published is the injury rate. And if you look on the left side there, the injury rate is not so different between men and women. This is from the IAAF top-level championships. Actually, Juan Manuel was one of the authors on this paper, I think. And what they showed was that the injury rate was similar, but if you look at the type of injuries, it's very different between men and women. So men are more likely to have thigh injuries, lower leg injuries, hip and groin. We all know that in any way if we work at Aspetar. Whereas women are 3 times as likely to have stress fractures. We see the same thing when we look at the Winter Olympics 2014. So the injury rate were more or less the same, but the types of injuries very different between men and women. With women more likely to have meniscus or cartilage injuries, concussion, knee injuries. And then the Summer Olympics in 2016, again, very similar injury rate, but women were more likely to have sprains and men were more likely to have lacerations and face and head injuries. Now, I have to say thank you to Torbjorn Soligard, who I think quite a few people know already, and our own Aziz, who helped me to reanalyze the raw data, because this wasn't published. It was published, but there was no sex group analysis in terms of injuries. So, and this is what we need to be careful of. When you're reading literature, it's so easy to think everybody is the same, but if you don't look down into the fine details, you won't know that it's actually very different. And then the FIFA competitions was the same. This was a paper that was published in 2013 where they looked at 1,500 matches. And again, injury rate similar, but the type of injuries different. So women were more likely to have fractures, head and neck injuries, and men, as usual, as we expect, more likely to have hip and groin injuries, thighs, and then contusions. We've also had some published articles in the past. This comes from 2018. Very similar story. Women are more likely to have stress fractures, so 3 times the rate, ACL ruptures, concussions, and when they get concussion, it tends to be worse. And men are more likely to have acute shoulder dislocations, hip and groin, and FAI. So, I think we can safely say that there are differences between men and women athletes, and that perhaps they are as different as apples and pears, or maybe men and chimpanzees. So why did I say probably? It's because we don't actually know the whole picture. This, what I've just referred to, is just injury and illness surveillance. We don't actually know what happens to female athletes in the literature the way we know what happens to male athletes, because people just don't report it, and they don't enroll female athletes in their studies. This is a paper that was published in 2014, looking at the three of the big sports medicine journals, and the title says it all. where are all the female participants in sports and exercise medicine research? And you can see that women are underrepresented significantly when it comes to injuries and illnesses compared to men. And the same is true for orthopedic literature. In this article that was published in 2015, 5 of the biggest orthopedic journals, and about a third of all articles included women or did a subgroup analysis to see what's the difference between men and women. And it's not just sports medicine. This is a very interesting case. So it's a famous study, the Baltimore longitudinal study of aging. Started in 1958. The whole point of this study was to see what happens when people age. And so in the first 20 years, they only enrolled men. And now we know that 95% of all people who live older than 110 are women. So this lady, Kane Tanaka, is the oldest living human in the world. She's 117 years old. She lives in Japan. She's still very strong and opinionated. Now imagine what she could have told them or what she could have taught them if they had bothered enrolling her from the beginning. But of course, now we'll have to wait another period of time before that will be useful. But it's also more serious because in cardiovascular research, for example, and this is an article that was published 2018, and the big criticism in this article was that women are underrepresented in drug trials. So this is important because we know that the metabolism is different for different drugs. We know that coronary syndrome and heart failure are 2 of the big cardiovascular killers in women, and yet they're testing the drugs but not with the same representation for women. So this is a prevalence-corrected participation rate. So subsequent to this, the Americans have come up with guidelines that basically force people to include women in their drug trials, otherwise the trial won't be allowed. And this is my favorite. Flibanserin is the female Viagra. So this drug was designed exclusively for the use in women. And this study wanted to see what is the effect if you take flibanserin with alcohol. And so they enrolled 25 participants, of which 23 were male. I mean, it's funny, but really, I'm not a researcher, I'm a clinician. So if I read this, I want to take something from this. I want to be able to apply this to my patient. How can I take anything from this? I know that alcohol is metabolized differently in women, and so is the drug probably. So it got published. So why is this important for us in sports medicine? Because of these 2. We could argue that these 2 players represent the best players in the world. So Lionel Messi and Megan Rapinoe have just... Sorry? They've just been awarded the FIFA Player of the Year award last year. Now imagine you are the physician for one of those 2. And now they get an injury, and you're not so familiar with this injury, so you want to read up about it, right? You want to make sure that you're doing the right thing. And it needs to be scientific, because if something goes wrong, you need to be able to explain why you've done this. So what do? You go to the world's best sports medicine journals. These are the 3 journals for the highest impact factor. And if you were Messi's doctor, then that's a good strategy. You're safe. You can do whatever. You can read the research, the review articles. You can read the latest research, and you can apply what you find. But if you're looking after Megan Rapinoe, then you have a problem. So I wanted to see if you consult these journals with an injury in a female footballer, what will you find? Remember, we're talking about external validity, so the population group that you are reading about needs to be the same as your patient. And I wanted to know original research articles only, because original research is recent, whereas review articles refer to the past. So let's forget about the past. If we just see what was happening at that time, which is now about a year ago when I did this analysis. And I looked specifically to see how many of those research projects included women, and whether they did a subgroup analysis, because there's no point just including women but you don't analyze the differences, then it doesn't help. And this is what I found. So of all the research articles in that 1 year period, if you went to the BJSM or the American Journal of Sports Medicine, 34% of articles will include women. and do an analysis. In the Sports Medicine Journal, it was 18%. And that's not great. But now what about football? Because remember, this is all sports. What about if I just narrow it down to football? Then it looks like this. So if you have a female footballer with a problem, your best bet is to go to the American Journal of Sports Medicine. But you'll only be lucky in about 25% of cases. You could go to BJSM, but the number drops to 14, which is not so much. And you don't even need to bother looking at sports medicine because you won't get any useful information there. In fact, you might as well go to the American Journal of Primatology. So what this means is that in the case of Messi, we can practice really good science, but in the case of Megan Rapinoe, we're talking about a fruit salad. There is one possible argument why this is the case, and that is that female athletes are a minority group. I hear this often. And to be honest, there's some truth about that. Unfortunately, we don't have really good data from FIFA and recent data from FIFA. The latest big count that they did, where they looked at all the member associations and counted the number of footballers in their countries, was in 2006, so it's a long time ago. And at that time, it was reported that 12% of all footballers in the world were women or girls. That's not much. But what was interesting is if you looked at the previous big count, which was 6 years before that, the increase in male participation was 21%, but in females it was 54%. So that was already a big increase then, and we know that there's been a recent explosion in interest in female football. And in fact, FIFA had said recently that they want to increase the number of women and girls playing from 30 million to 60 million. So we're talking about a 100% increase by 2026. So the landscape is changing in female football. It's not there yet, it's not equal to men yet, but it's definitely changing. But if you're involved in Olympic sports, it's already there. So this is Olympic female participation since 1920 until now. And you can see that the Tokyo Olympics is going to be the most gender equal Olympics ever. 49% of all athletes will be female. So if you're working with an Olympic sport, this is not a minority group anymore. And of course, if we're going to, there's a trend now, global trend, for people to change sports medicine from sports medicine to sports and exercise medicine, where we want to get the general population active. And if we are going to voluntarily do that, then we have to embrace the fact that 50% of our population will be female. That's not a group you can ignore. But the key message is this: it's also not a group you can include by pretending that they're exactly the same as the other 50%. And in fact, Hippocrates knew this. Hippocrates was a very wise old man. He lived more than 2,000 years ago, but he said something which I think is very true. It's far more important to know what person the disease has than what disease the person has. So, if you think about this, at some stage in your life probably, maybe you, or your wife, or your daughter, or your mother, or some female family member will be a sports medicine patient. And if you believe, like I do, that female patients deserve exactly the same high-quality, evidence-based medical care as male patients, then we have to move away from this fruit salad sports medicine for females to a real science. And a real science is something which recognizes the fact that gender equality is not gender similarity. Thank you.